Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. How about going to India and meeting somebody new? How'd you like that? And how about meeting a sociologist? Okay, I'll go there. I have a friend, Jill Carr Harris, who has a lot of friends in India because she's lived there 40 years. And she has a sociologist friend that she thinks I ought to meet because he and I are both sociologists. So, no,
Yes,
we
yeah,
have
that's what I
something
heard.
in common.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn the microphone over for the moment to Jill, who's going to introduce us. And I haven't talked to this man before, so we're going to get acquainted and find out what he's up to. Jill, take over.
Yeah, hi everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing John Robert Clammer. And John has been it's been a pleasure to interact with him on numerous occasions in India. He's currently at the OP Jindal University, which is just outside of Delhi, in the Liberal Arts and Humanities Department as a sociologist. And John has done some very interesting research on past issues and many things in India. But I think his background, having a PhD from Oxford, master's and PhD was from Oxford in social anthropology. And John, you've been really focused on Japan mainly, but also India and the Chinese diaspora, I think, in your research, and looked at a whole host of areas in terms of development of those societies, but also the sustainability of their development, planning and projects and processes, often which are very unsustainable. And I think, John, you've also looked at conflict, whether through economic theory, social theory, and your stint at the UN University in Tokyo must have given you a wonderful platform to meet with so many international students. Uh, that's what we thought we'd talk about.
Are you mostly focused on Japan or India or equally?
Well, both. And I lived in Southeast Asia for a long time, based in Singapore. So
Hmm.
in the end, I've ended up covering kind of three regions of Asia, as it were: Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Japan. Interesting contrast between them too, especially between India and Japan. Very, very different kind of societies. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, opposite in their characters.
Almost opposite, almost
Yeah,
opposite.
yeah,
The
yeah.
I,
attitudes to things, you've been in Japan, you've seen this, yeah.
I'm sorry. How would you say opposite? I mean, that's not a thought that had ever occurred to me.
But I mean, the contrast between the kind of cultures, the personal attitudes, the social structures, the way people behave in relation to one another, um, ideas of everything from, I sure would know this for sure, ideas of time, promptness, um, personal interpersonal behavior and so on. They're really very different. You really have to switch. I have to switch every time I travel between one and the other. It's always quite a contrast arriving at the other place, remembering things will be done very differently, very differently.
I was
I
in.
just
I took a trip around the world in 1980, or 79 and 80, and I was in Japan. Sorry, I went to India first for a month, and then China for about 3 weeks, and then Japan about, I don't know, nearly a month. And I kind of know what you're saying, but to me, the shock was because I was going from India to China, because that was what I would call opposite.
opposite.
In those
Yeah.
days. Yeah. What are the issues and uh, uh, topics that you study, and do you do it? Do you ever do a comparative analysis?
Well, implicitly, yes. I mean, all sorts of interesting things come up in relation to things like, in Japan, as you know, there's a peace constitution, the whole attitude towards issues of war and so on, in principle, right? Although it's a country that spends an awful lot of money on its military, although it keeps that very quiet, yeah. Worried about China, of course, constantly. Worried about North Korea, particularly North Korea's kind of nuclear ambitions and the fact they don't seem to be willing to give those up. Yeah. Um, Here in India, I appreciate you'll see it's a much more militant attitude to things. Only a couple of months ago, we had a brief war, as you must have known about, with Pakistan. Mr. Trump claims he solved the problem by stepping between them. And the attitude here was kind of, let's go and get them. Sort of, these people are troublemakers, we should stamp them. I mean, the thing that caused the conflict in the first place was this horrific massacre of totally innocent civilian tourists, right, in Kashmir. But it was not at all peaceful, despite the fact you get a lot of rhetoric in India about, peace, quiet, one of the great tranquil civilizations of the world. The everyday practice is not like that at all. There's quite a lot of violence beneath the surface. And one of the things I like about going to Japan is the knowledge that crime is so low. I could leave my wallet on the table at Starbucks or somewhere and go off and do something. It would still be there when I come back. Nobody would touch it. It wouldn't happen here, I'm afraid. There is a lot of underlying violence as well. So what's kind of I find interesting is that difference between the kind of rhetoric of. I mean, Japan has not been involved in a conflict, of course, since the war. And in fact, the Constitution only allows the use of the armed forces in UN-mandated peacekeeping operations.
Every so often, this seems to come to the fore because for a brief period of time, there'll be a flurry of emails asking me to help publicize the fact that the government is trying to overthrow or reverse that constitutional clause limiting the military to, I presume.
Yeah.
What is it like? What is the rule? I know that they can have some armed forces, but they're not called the army, right?
No, they're not called the army. They're called self-defense forces.
Right.
Okay. And the Constitution mandates again that they are for self-defense. They say the only reason they can be deployed outside the country is for a UN-mandated peacekeeping mission. Okay. And they have been. There've been Japanese troops in the Golan Heights, for example. And at the end of the Gulf War, minesweepers were sent to the Gulf to kind of clear up the mess. But there has been this move, you're right. The late Mr. Abe, the former prime minister, who was, again, I think almost uniquely assassinated. I mean, this doesn't happen in Japan much, right? It's got a gun by a homemade gun. Was in fact trying to move in the direction of changing the constitution. The excuse was it would make Japan a normal country, in a sense, to have potentially belligerent armed forces. Part of the problem with that is, of course, the neighboring countries don't feel that at all, right? Southeast Asia is very hostile to the idea of Japan not rearming, because it has rearmed. The armed forces are actually quite big. Even though they keep quoting this wonderful figure that only 1% of GNP is used.
Are you talking India now or what?
No, Japan.
Japan.
Oh, I thought you were saying that the attitude.
No, in Japan. No, India, the defense budget is very large.
Oh,
it's
yes,
very large.
I know.
The army is very big. And, the excuse again, it used to be Pakistan, if this dangerous and belligerent neighbor. The state of Kashmir is still divided by what's called a line of control. There is no agreed border between the two. It's still disputed. And of course, now China. There's a lot of worry about what China is up to on the sort of northeastern borders, where there has been slow encroachment. This kind of, what do they call it, salami cutting or whatever it is, little bit by little bit, move 100 meters and then move another 100 meters. And the Chinese have this knack of discovering old maps, which definitely show that Tibet is part of China, the whole of the South China Sea is part of China, and so on. But then, of course, it's not so hard to come up with old maps if you look around in your archives. But that is also, I think, a current fear that India lost a war in the early years of independence. There was a Chinese invasion of part of the northeast, and have been very, very sensitive to that, sensitive border zone, because always been problematic for other reasons. I mean, it borders now Bangladesh, And there are issues about migration, illegal or illegal migration, particularly Bangladeshis into India. And in fact, the law, Jill will know this, of course, that the government introduced the Law Citizenship Act, which actually basically requires people to prove their citizenship, not that it's assumed you are a citizen if you're a resident here, but in some cases, if you want to get on an electoral roll, for example, that you should have some kind of documentary proof that you've been in India at least since the 1970s to kind of justify this. Of course, there are many people who don't have that kind of documentation, have come from probably Bangladesh or somewhere else. Though the law is interesting, it does allow the migration of people from neighboring countries into India, provided they're not Muslim. Okay, but that is also
everybody in Bangladesh is Muslim.
well, everybody. I mean, there is a small Hindu population, tiny Christian population. Same true in Pakistan or Afghanistan, whatever, who officially can come. But of course, obviously, as you say, 99 point something percent of the population, of course, are Muslim. So effectively, it excludes any of those people from any kind of legal migration into the country, into India.
Has that been the case all along, or is this a new Modi idea?
Well, as you probably know, I mean, Modi is pushing a very right-wing Hindu majoritarian agenda. It's worrying a lot of people. It's worrying religious minorities in particular, because there's fear that they would regard it essentially as not Indian, or any criticism directed at the state is interpreted as some kind of treason rather than simply, by expressing an opinion. There is fear of that kind, I think.
Well, now you don't have Indian papers or anything, do you? And you're a British citizen, or what's the implication for you? Do we have to be careful talking to you about this?
Oh yes, very, very dangerous. No, I mean, it means, of course, that I'm here on a visa. I'm here on employment visa, which could, in principle, be withdrawn at any time. And there have been a few scary moments. Last year when renewing, I started getting all sorts of queries about people I'd been in touch with. What was my relationship to one particular foundation? Jill, I'm sure, knows the Heinrich Ball Foundation, which has a very active office here. I've done work with them. What was my connection? There was no problem in the end. This stuff had been published. It was on their website. I referred them to the website. If you want to look it up, it's there. Okay, go on.
But this rule about everybody can come except Muslims, is this a new rule, or has it been there forever?
The rule is new because of the change in the law, but the attitude is not new at all. Yeah. In fact, again, one of the huge, big issues here, I'm sure you know, no more than 25 years ago in Gujarat, the violent anti-Muslim riots, which broke out because a group of Hindus, or very, very militant Hindus, had gone to the site of a mosque, city of Ayodhya, which they claimed was built on the basis of the mosque had been a Hindu temple.
Right.
And particularly significant one, because it's supposed to be the birthplace of one of the important gods, Ram. Okay, and proceeded to tear the mosque down, literally deconstruct it with their pickaxes and so on. That, of course, led to huge outbursts on the part of the Muslim community, and this led to very, very severe rioting, particularly in Gujarat, where Mr. Modi at that time was the chief minister. And this is still a controversial issue. The BBC made a movie about this about a year ago, Jill, which cannot be legally seen in India. And the BBC Delhi office got raided, and all sorts of allegations about not paying tax and so on. Because nobody accuses Mr. Modi of going out and murdering anybody. But as chief minister, he did nothing. I mean, he sat there for 3 or 4 days before the army or anybody was mobilized to, prevent this violent rioting. And that the memories of that, of course, still very much alive for many people.
Okay. But this is something one does here. Yeah. This is all pretty familiar to me. Sorry, Jill, what were you saying?
Yeah, I'm just curious, this very interesting point you're making between rhetoric and substantive action. I mean, I think in spite of, India being 1.4 billion, you still see a huge number of peace activities in the country as well, in all fairness. No? And having been part of the Peace Builders Forum, as you've seen, and so on, many of the peace activists have come from a Gandhian background and have been working on peace. And similarly in Japan, the civil society has been very active, hasn't it, in terms of the whole nuclear issue. So,
Yes, particularly that issue. Yeah.
so I think the civil societies stand out as really strong peace-based civil societies. In Canada, we have heard about the Japanese, all of the Hibikshu people who have come to say no more nuclear war and have helped to strengthen the anti-nuclear movement in Canada. There's been a very good liaison and so on. So I want to quickly add that the civil societies are very robust in peacemaking, aren't they, in both the countries? Have you
More so than Canada.
maybe, yeah, more so than Canada? Yeah. Any reflection on that?
Well, one of the effects is, if there's any positive effect of the 2011 tsunami, of course, this destruction, or almost complete destruction of the Fukushima nuclear plant, was to reactivate, I think, really to put the heat up once again under the anti-nuclear movement, not only directed at the possibility of weapons, and officially nuclear weapons are not allowed on Japanese soil. The US forces will never confirm or deny whether they have them when their ships and aircraft carriers and so on are in Japanese ports. But presumably Japan does not. So that I think has kept that issue very, very much alive. And rightly so, because I think the dangers of nuclear power, were revealed not only by that, but that debate showed up, in fact, lots of power stations that had problems. There'd been leaks which were never admitted. And at least one, it turned out, when the fresh geological survey was done, was on an active fault, which is not the best place to build your nuclear power station. So you're right that it has kept that very much alive. Yeah, and I think it's not quite the rhetoric and reality issue. It's a just dimension of that is indeed the strength of the kind of anti-war movement in Japan is strong, is genuinely strong.
Yeah.
And as the year before last, the A-bomb Survivors Association in Hiroshima won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, sure.
And I've kept very much, that aging group of the people who are still there, who were surviving, children at the time, obviously, very, very much kept this kind of issue alive. And that has not been allowed to disappear. There have been movements to do this in Hiroshima itself, for example. There are movements among some citizens that kind of, let's forget this, that's 75 years ago or something. Now it's a modern city. We have the museum and so on. People will come. It's kind of pilgrimage site in a sense, but put it behind them. But that's very strongly resisted.
Well, now what is, if you look at public opinion polls and compare it to other countries, is the strength of opposition to nuclear, let's say both, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, stronger in Japan than it would be in, let's say, Europe or most other countries? And well, answer that first. Is it? But then let's look at the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, because I think that is changing. Okay, now what would the public opinion polls say about attitudes about both nuclear power and nuclear weapons in Japan?
Nuclear weapons, I think, are a no-no. And of course, people would obviously fall back on the constant argument that Japan was the only place that ever was actually attacked with nuclear weapons. Right? That the language of that is very much alive. Nuclear power, again, I think is opposed by an awful lot of people. There's some ambiguity there in the sense, of course, it's a high energy society. You know, you ever seen one of those maps of the world at night? You know, and one of the places glowing like a huge, glowworm is Japan. Of course, it's power consumption very high. You know?
But also, its energy sources, local sources of energy is pretty low. I think they don't have much oil or gas or that kind of fossil.
They don't. They
have to import.
But one of the sources which people often do point to, my colleagues at the UN, when I was working at the UNU at Tokyo, were very much onto this, was because thermal power. It's a volcanic country, highly volcanic country. You know, I mean, Iceland. I think most of the heating and so on, I think, comes precisely from thermal power, and it's kind of free once you put in the infrastructure. You know, the fuel is there, right? It's under.
That's a great idea. In fact, they're not using it much, are they?
But they're not using it. Japan is. I mean, there's a little bit of solar. There's a certain amount of wind power. You see. I remember being there. You know, goodness sake, a week ago, Thursday, right? I just got back this time last week. In northern Japan, lots and lots of what do you call them? The windmill things. And increasing number of houses that would have their private solar panels on the roof, to reduce their own electricity consumption. But oddly, the country as a whole, the government does not seem to have made a concerted move towards alternatives.
Renewables.
And particularly the use of this thermal energy, which would seem to me to be the obvious way to go. And, I've been in parts of Japan, in Kyushu, for example, where you literally see steam coming out of the ground. You know, the manholes, whatever you call them, sometimes literally, that close to the surface, easily tapped source. But why there is resistance to this, I really don't know. It seems to me to be the obvious way to go, but yet, curiously, it's not been exploited where I thought.
And being such a technological society, it's quite curious that wave energy, thermal energy, wind energy have not been, good renewable.
It's true. There are little experiments. Again, somewhere in Kyushu, there was a big plan to dam one of the big bays to create, this tidal energy, which is created by, twice a day the tide flows in, twice a day it flows out. And that had lots of problems attached to it, particularly ecological ones. It was going to destroy the marine life. It was going to lead to probably silting and all sorts of things like this. I think part of the project went ahead. I don't recall now whether it was ever, really completed. But yes, given the technological know-how, you'd have thought that other options that were pretty obvious would have been exploited.
And then putting the nuclear waste into the water has been a very controversial issue, hasn't it? I mean,
with the Fukushima plant, because I don't know if you're sure of this, Meta, because the nuclear plants require a lot of cooling water to keep them cool, particularly ones undergoing meltdown, which the Fukushima plant was doing. And this seawater was pumped up to cool, and of course, thousands and thousands of gallons were. There's a whole vast farm of those big tanks, which you usually see for storing oil, actually storing water, but they reach capacity. So then the decision was made to discharge that water, which still has some level of radioactivity, back into the Pacific, which caused a lot of problems around the rest of the world. The Chinese and Koreans refused to eat Japanese seafood for quite a long time on the grounds that the International Atomic Energy people said, no, the level is so low, it's basically not much higher than usual background radiation. But you can understand why people are very reluctant to eat food that was potentially contaminated.
Absolutely. I would be too. I was wondering whether the Fukushima incident has changed public opinion about nuclear power in Japan. Did it make it more repulsive to people than it had been?
Yeah. No, it did. Because, again, and I'm sure Joe knows, I mean, the rhetoric from the nuclear industry is this is terribly safe. It's a non-carbon, it's not producing lots of carbon and all this kind of stuff. Things don't really go wrong, but of course this blew the lid on that whole kind of argument. right? That it's very unsafe, it's vulnerable, particularly in a very seismic place, including this question of the disposal of waste. If buried, for example, there's no guarantee that a future earthquake would not rupture, whatever kind of caverns or something they'd stored stuff in. So no, it did. It very, very actively promoted a strong reaction to the fact, why are we doing this? Particularly when the government is talking about building more nuclear power stations, not closing down the existing ones, but actually increasing the number to meet energy needs.
What is the major energy sources in Japan? Is it nuclear power one of them?
No, it's still oil and coal. Nuclear constitutes, I think, about 20% of the total energy consumption. But renewables constitute very, very tiny percent. It's probably running around 2% or something like this, and is negligible in terms of the total, energy consumption. Which is another side of the problem, which is addressing excessive energy use, including contexts in which you really don't need all that much energy. You don't need that. I mean, there's a cute example which Jill may have heard. Japan is infested with vending machines. Those things you put your money in and it has canned drinks or cigarettes or whatever. They're everywhere. And someone added up the total number of vending machines in the country. And they're very clever. I mean, in the winter, they'll give you hot coffee. In the summer, you get iced coffee. Right? Calculated that the energy consumption of the total number of vending machines in Japan was equal to the total energy consumption of Bangladesh. Okay. And you will often see them, Jill, right? Remote country road. You're driving along, you see some glowing thing in front of you along the road. When you come to it, you find it's a vending machine standing in the middle of nowhere, selling Coke or or whatever it is. Right? Which is an illustration of that. I mean, there must be ways of increasing the efficiency of that kind of technology that would, in fact, reduce consumption. In which case, the need for excessive generation would itself be significantly modified.
As an activist, and also in a way as a sociologist, I'm interested in the linkage or the lack of linkage between the global warming of climate change crisis and issue and movement and peace movements. And now it seems to me that the connection keeps changing, and that I, as an activist, I would like to make a strong point that we, if you want to work on climate change, you need to work on reducing nuclear weapons and war and so on. I want to link these two things. I figured that if we could put them together as a single movement, we would have a lot more power than we do now. But it's really hard to do. You cannot easily make the connection. The only obvious connection is money. You can easily say, well, if you're spending all that money on nuclear and other military things, you don't have it available to use for the kinds of interventions you need for climate change. Well, that doesn't, you could say that about anything. So what we really would like to connect is to say that you want to get rid of nuclear things in general, nuclear weapons, nuclear power, etc. And you also need to do that by changing, the way you handle your climate interventions, and I see a potential argument there in the connection between the nuclear power and the which unfortunately is inevitably linked one way or another to nuclear weaponry. And that is that, especially through the business of enrichment. Now, people are going to constantly say we need nuclear power for because we can't get along with just wind and solar as an alternative to fossil fuels. So let's put in a lot more nuclear power plants. And the argument there is every time you have a nuclear power plant, you have nuclear waste. And people, then what are you going to do? Well, you're going to try to make it you're going to enrich it. If you have this nuclear waste lying here and there and everywhere, people can either take it and try to enrich it, or they can they want it for their nuclear weapons. And the more waste you have, the more access there is to nuclear sources of nuclear weaponry. And I think that is an argument that would carry some weight, except now, with the situation with Russia and the export of oil and so on, countries, I think there's a lot stronger demand now in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, 3 years, let's say, for accepting nuclear power plants, and because of the argument that we have to get rid of fossil fuels, and Russia is no longer a good source, and so a lot of countries now would consider putting in nuclear power that might not have been before. And I don't know whether any of the groups working on climate change in Japan and India have made that, or nuclear or peace groups, because now the peace groups in India are not focused on nuclear weapons, whereas the peace groups in Japan, I think the nuclear weapons issue is the key one for peace issues. So I wonder if this linkage has been exploited or even noticed, with any regularity in both countries or either country, as far as you know.
I think basically the answer is no. I don't know if Joe would agree that this is exactly the kind of fairly hidden link that people have not really spotted as being, as you say, the obvious question comes up, what are you going to do with the waste, or accidents in nuclear plants, the very upfront, thing that's going to happen in a crisis. But that slightly deeper level of connection, I don't think has been explored very much. Yeah? So it is different in the two countries. I don't think there's been major nuclear accident here in India, Jill, has there?
No, there was a close
plant not so
there was
far from in Tamil Nadu, of course, but it hasn't. Whereas Japan has obviously experienced that, particularly in 2011, and the issue of having been a victim of an actual A-bomb attack. That language is still very, very much alive. But linking. I mean, I think the linkages. There are multiple ways. In fact, that linkage could be made or should be exposed a little more fully, as you say. I mean, I think the issue in Iran, over the last couple of weeks, right, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, actually does show that up. They keep insisting that, of course, they are working on nuclear development. It's entirely for peaceful purposes, right? Though, in fact, of course, once the enrichment process is there, it can be upgraded, obviously, to produce weapons-grade uranium. Okay. And
also the linkage, if they want to bomb nuclear facility, there really is a question of how much contamination they're going to create by this bombing. And I don't know that anybody claims that by bombing this Natanz, is that where they bombed in Iran, that they actually spread any radioactivity in the environment. But you can't ignore that. And of course you can't ignore that when in regard to that nuclear place in Ukraine either, where
I thought that was a very scary, but the very point you point out. I mean, if you really bomb these places, you're bound to create all sorts of mess And if nuclear elements are there, they would surely indeed be released, potentially released. I mean, the US also doesn't like to admit that, in fact, your other point about, enriching or recycling waste does in fact possess what's called depleted nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
These are artillery shells. These are not bombs, right? Which do in fact contain,
Yeah.
apart from their likely effect on the immediate target that they would be used against. Again, it is true, of course, that collectively the world's militaries are, if not the biggest, definitely one of the biggest creators of pollution of all kinds, right? Of climate change, of waste, of resource use, of petrol. I saw the figures recently. I'm terribly bad at math, okay, so I never remember figures. But one of these, supersonic fighter aircraft, which everybody wants to possess these days, in an hour's flying on a, not a war mission necessarily, simply a training mission, burns as much oil as would run the entire Delhi bus service for at least a month. That's in an hour. Okay. And of course, these things flying around all the time. So, I mean, that I think also should be exposed a little bit more. It's not only a question of like the arms trade, but in fact, what is going on in terms of pollution, contribution to climate change?
It is excluded according to, I know it was a Kyoto document, and I believe almost equally so, the Paris Accord, that they simply do not require countries to report or even count the use of fossil fuels for or the emission of greenhouse gas for military purposes. That is just,
Exactly.
it doesn't count. You get a free pass for that. And that is what's shocking, because if people realize that, and they, it's really, really appalling. I think that's absolutely true. Also, I read there's another wonderful statistic along the same lines that that 40% of the cost of a war overseas, such as the Americans in Afghanistan, is expenditure of transporting the fuel to that region for the military to use then to do whatever killing and bombing it wants to do. So it's not even the amount of CO2 emitted by the bombing and the destruction, but it's the amount of CO2 used to bring the fuel there in order to do the bad things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I know. Paradoxically, right? You're burning just to move your gas around.
Yeah.
This is true, and other things, munitions, food, the entire vast infrastructure of any kind of military operation is enormously energy intensive. You're feeding thousands of people, you're providing not only oil and petrol, whatever, you're providing all the other equipment that is necessary, right? And indeed, this is being transported all over the world. So you see figures for merchant shipping, right? What the contribution of merchant shipping, container traffic and this kind of stuff, but you're right, this is one of those kind of concealed databases. I think how much in fact is being used and how much that secrecy in fact undermines other kinds of climate initiatives, because we don't know those figures or are not even aware of them, because I think they're not on our radar most of the time. They're not the thing that strikes you immediately.
This area of peace and the linkage between peace and climate, I think, is very, very important. But I think I've prematurely detracted you from where I should have started, is just to ask you about your research, because maybe you're doing something about agriculture or gender relations.
No.
What do you study most recently?
Well, lots of things. I spent 2 years in Kyoto, just 2-3 years ago, attached to Kyoto University, but also to their Institute for Disaster Prevention. I don't know how many disasters they prevent, right? And the project that I worked on there as a sociologist was, in fact, post-conflict and post-disaster reconstruction. Okay? And that, of course, has many dimensions. There's a lot of parallels between post-conflict and post-disaster, including the physical damage, the pollution, the enormous amounts of waste, of weaponry, of unexploded munitions, of all those kinds of things, right? They can occur. There are a lot of parallels. That's coming out as a book soon, I hope.
Oh,
It's in the press now. That project's going out in the press now.
What
But
are some of the other disasters that are brought in under this umbrella?
Natural disasters, unfortunately, there are many. They're all over the Pacific. Here in India, the great Gujarat earthquake, for example, it happened again some time ago. There have been disastrous landslides in Kashmir 3 or 4 years ago. Unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of like the natural disaster. And interesting parts, of course, the big Indian Ocean tsunami, of course, its impact on places like Indonesia, particularly, and also southern coast of India and Sri Lanka, where that tsunami, not the 2011 one, the big Indian Ocean one, of course, caused enormous damage on actually both sides of the Pacific, effectively. Yeah. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this, in fact, about how to put communities back together so far as you can after this, because there's the physical dimension, obviously, of damage, destruction, and whatever. But of course, there are all the psychological issues of reconciliation, right? Or just coming to terms with the fact that your original environment has been basically destroyed by a natural disaster. Vast shifts in. And I have colleagues here who are in psychology department. I've been trying to get them to work a little bit on this issue. The psychology of not just conflict, why white people get into violence in the first place, but the post-trauma and trauma, which is not necessarily because you were direct, victim of some kind of violence. In Aceh, in Indonesia, for example, which we studied part of our project, people lost homes. People were relocated somewhere, but the new place was not the place they were familiar with. It had no associations. It had no history to them. It had no memories, right? And those kind of issues are very prevalent, I think, in both these kinds of situations, right? Mm-hmm. So the violence may come in the sense of a natural disaster, or it might come, obviously, in the case of cases like Sierra Leone, Congo, other cases we've looked at, where life is really very violent on an almost daily basis. And to live with those kinds of circumstances, bring your children up under those kinds of things. And again, the hidden cases. I mean, one of the situations almost nobody knows about is Cameroon. Have anybody in Canada ever talks about Cameroon? It's almost like a Quebec. It's almost like a Quebec-like situation. The French-speaking majority wants the whole country to be French-speaking. The English speakers, particularly in the south part of Cameroon, have been resisting this. There's in fact, vicious fighting going on constantly. I've never seen anything in the press, the international press, that ever mentions the name of Cameroon. And if I mention this to other people, they go, where, what's happening in Cameroon? Mm-hmm. Actually, that's the point. Mm-hmm. We don't know because it never gets any kind of publicity.
Actually, we did an interview with a friend, a judge in Cameroon about that issue about a year ago. And that's the first time I'd heard of it. And of course, I have no updates on what has happened.
No, just that, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I'm in touch with people there on a regular basis, and this conflict is going on. Francophones versus the Anglophones. Most of my students here literally cannot find on the map. Say, well, show me where it is, and they don't know. Oh, it's somewhere in Africa. Africa's rather big, right? Quite a large continent, but they have no idea where it is. I'm sure there are other cases, obviously, a bit like that.
John, are you really saying that both war and what you say these man-made disasters, but I'm assuming you also mean climate-based disasters as well, are creating the same sorts of trauma which need intervention? Is that what you were trying to get at?
It's partly true. Obviously, the part of the psychology of this is a little different. if you've been subject to violence in a sort of military sense, something like this, as opposed to a natural disaster, which, you can't explain in the same kind of ways. You can't put your finger on political issues that would have caused this to happen in the first place. So there isn't a solution in that, any kind of obvious political sense, right? But there are quite a lot of parallels, and there are quite a lot of parallels in terms of putting people back together again, as it were, putting communities back together again. And again, there's an interesting case in Japan. It's what, 25 years ago now, at least, the Great Kobe earthquake. City of Kobe in West Japan, as you've probably heard of, was subject to a very severe earthquake. A large number of casualties. A lot of the city was destroyed. And obviously, it was not badly intentioned. Survivors were dispersed anywhere where there was like public housing available, vacancies for public housing, rather than putting people in containers. People were dispersed all over the place. And it was quickly discovered this was a very bad idea. Particularly elderly people had no community. They didn't have any network of support. They had nothing of this kind. After the big tsunami here, one of the lessons learned was resettle people together.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, to ensure that some
Communities.
kind of community structure, familiarity, and those kind of things is transferred to the hopefully temporary living conditions that people are going to be in. But some of those temporary conditions go on for years, in some cases, right? And I think it was a very positive lesson that was learned from the Kobe situation. Don't just disperse people, because breaking up their social networks is very damaging. It's not only physical effects of loss of home or severe damage to your business and this kind of stuff that counts. It's also very much that you want to keep those cultural and social links intact insofar as you can.
And Japan and India are both clan-based or collective societies, so it's particularly important that because so much of their welfare and comes from their community.
Very much so. Very much
Now,
so.
now let's play with that question and apply it in a different sense, because I don't know whether there has been research on that question with regard to bringing in populations of immigrants. Let's say we're with the Ukraine war, quite a number of Ukrainians were brought immediately into Canada. Can you say, and is there any research about the how much difference it makes, or what are the effects of bringing them in and settling them and scattered around versus in an existing community of, there are quite a number of Ukrainians who've lived in Canada a long time. So, you could in principle put them in a big batch someplace, and maybe they've done it both ways. I'm not quite sure, but would that, if you're thinking about how they integrate into a society, let's assume we're talking about a population that you expect to stay put, would that be a good idea, or to keep them in clusters, or would you think that it's desirable to scatter them? I think most immigrants, for example, in Canada coming from Asia, would to some extent settle in proximity to each other in cities if they have a choice. But what are the effects of the different forms of settlement of immigrants?
Well, the sociological studies are a bit ambiguous.
It's not something I've ever done any study of sociologically, or even familiar with. But
I say the scattered model, the danger is that people get very isolated. They don't know people. They can't. There's no one who, if they don't speak whatever their new language is well. The collective model is that people sometimes become a bit clannish, but there's another level within that. Study done in Rotterdam, for example, in Holland, there's a big, not South Asian, but like North African, Middle Eastern population, discovered that men went out, but an awful lot of the women remained very much within their community, did not speak Dutch, and did not integrate at all with the local community. Would shop with other shops by Moroccans or Syrians or wherever they were from. The men necessarily had to go out because they had to find work and integrated to a certain level. So I had a friend who taught in an elementary school in Rotterdam. So it was rather interesting. When you had parent-teacher day, either only the fathers would come because the mothers couldn't speak Dutch, or if the mother did come, she had nothing to contribute because she couldn't understand what she was saying, unless there was an interpreter present. So it's a bit ambiguous.
An interesting phenomenon
Right
that
mix.
children often go to the take their mother to the doctor. If the mother has to see the doctor,
yes.
the
That's
children
exactly what was happening.
interpret. And the children even have to learn, words for medical issues or anatomical parts that they wouldn't normally have to talk about because they have to translate for their mothers to the doctor because they learn English and the mother doesn't. Isn't that interesting?
Yes. Yeah. No, I've seen that. I've seen that also quite frequently. Children as the interpreter, and the kind of go-between, especially in hospitals or even on the bus. I saw once the child, the mother didn't know how to buy the ticket, didn't know what the fare was, and the child was actually doing the interpretation. They adapt because by the second generation, on the whole, this is not a problem, unless they get radicalized or they're undergoing some other kind of re-socialization in the new place. So there's a gender issue often connected with that too.
That's true. Okay. Well, okay. This is interesting. What are your plans now? What are you? You're in India at the moment. Are you going to be staying there a while?
Yes. We're just starting our semester.
Yeah.
In fact, officially tomorrow, but in fact, classes will start on Monday. It's a Friday, of course, tomorrow. No, I will be teaching, carrying on with all sorts of research. And again, I don't know if Jill knows anything about this. I'm teaching what I think may be the first university level course in solidarity economy.
Wonderful.
I don't know if there are other universities that are specifically teaching it as a distinct subject, and I'm trying this out. And so next week I will launch into that and see how many students come. Because going back to your earlier kind of analysis, Meta, I mean, one of the issues that also gets often left out of these kind of peace discussions is the nature of the economy, right? And what economy does to separate people or to create inequalities, to do all those kinds of things, right? Far from generating happiness and wealth for everybody, is doing the opposite. So that's another issue that I think.
Let's give me a moment, a sort of an overview of the course on solidarity economy. I'm just trying to imagine what such a course might cover.
I can send you a syllabus if you like.
Okay, that'd be nice.
Right. It's in my computer somewhere.
Tell me
if you want to read it.
I do, but I'm thinking, what will your first lecture be? What is your way of describing the content of the course?
Well, the basic point zero, as it were, the point which you're starting, is that ideally an economy should be something that promotes sustainability, promotes equality between people, promotes sharing, equitable sharing of resources, this kind of thing, which is actually what our contemporary economies on the whole do not do. Mm-hmm. So the basic idea is, how would we set about designing an economy which would deliver the kind of human qualities that we would want, right? That the economy itself becomes a kind of ethical, what would you call it? Ethical something, far from ethics being left out of discussion of economy, that it's built into the very nature of the way in which relationships between people, and many, many other things that have gone, there's community economies, localism, community currencies, and all sorts of experiments. There are a lot of very interesting experiments around the world where people are actually trying to create equitable and ecologically sustainable, socially desirable kind of economy. So that's what we're setting out to explore. Mm-hmm. And I'm making the course a kind of workshop. It's not a lecture thing, be telling them about this. They have to do things all the time. They have to design things. They have to look at examples. They have to analyze case studies and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's an experiment, but I wish me luck. that's the first time I've taught it as a consistent course for a whole semester, and see how the students respond to this.
Uh-huh.
I'll let you know.
Well,
But if
I
you would
look
like the
forward-
syllabus, I'll happily send it. Right.
I really would love to see your syllabus, and maybe we can have.
I forward it to you in the morning.
Very good. We may have a follow-up conversation about that.
We can. Anytime. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. This has been fun, just as I knew it would be. I mean, Jill sets things up, and they're always fun. So thank you. And
Delighted to meet you. And so thank you for taking the time. And Jill, too, for setting things up. So anytime we want to continue conversation,
All right.
I'm around. Okay. All right.
Very
Yeah,
good.
John, a big thanks.
All right.
Happy day, the rest of you.
Yeah.
I
Have a
can
good
hopefully
evening.
my dinner is
Bye.
ready, I hope so.
Good.
Go and feed my